So yes, I want to talk today very shortly about home automation, or beer automation as the case may be, in Python. And specifically, one project in particular that has kind of symbolized or sort of taken over the home automation space for Python. Now, as Calvin mentioned, this was kind of a last-minute thing. I kind of threw this together, so I apologize. This is going to be a little bit more right-brainy than full-on techie. If people are interested, tell Calvin or tell other people, and just basically agitate for me to come back and do a follow-up. I promise I can totally bring in like gadgets and doodads and stuff and light things up across the room and wave my hands and make the colors turn and all that good stuff. So if you're interested in this, consider this a preview, part 1 perhaps. And if you don't like it, then let them know that too, and then I can just slink off into a corner and hide, and everyone will be happy. So, all right. So with that, we can go into sort of what I wanted to talk about, which I want to talk about Python, and we'll get to Python eventually, but first I want to talk about home automation, because home automation is one of these things that's kind of it's kind of a thing that a lot of people like to talk about, and like, people have ideas about it. Maybe they've been in someone's house, and you got the person who has their phone out and they're like hitting buttons on their phone and the lights turn on and it's all cool, or their locks, or alarms go off, and of course half the time it doesn't work, and so you kind of get this idea this is what home automation is. So I wanted to talk a little bit about fundamentally what home automation is about, like at its core, what is home automation? And of course, this being the month of October, and because of the fact that Calvin very kindly told me when I was getting ready for my talk today that this is an Oktoberfest themed talk, and I absolutely have to get a reference to beer into my talk, I definitely wanted to point out that the number one most important thing that everyone does with home automation is home brewing. This is the thing that you do with home automation. Everyone should have a home brew system, and of course you need sensors and so on to, detect the various chemical reactions and temperatures and what have you. Maybe automatically turn down the heat on a burner or something like that to make sure that you get the absolute best home brew you can with a minimum of fuss. And of course, if the computers are watching, then you don't have the excuse of saying, oh yeah, I totally forgot to turn the thing and make the thing do the thing. That's why the beer tastes terrible, and everyone like shakes their head and goes off to, Fort Ray or something. So that's the number one thing, of course, as we all know, the most important thing that home automation does. But of course, the other thing is dance parties. It seems like half the time when I see a home automation demo, it's from someone like Philips, who does the Hue light bulbs, and it usually has to do with some kind of color changing light bulb, and they'll have a computer sitting back somewhere, and they'll have like lights going and flashing and changing colors, and they'll have really awesome music and a bunch of very beautiful looking people going and having a great, I know, I apologize for traumatizing you with that. And everyone seems to think, okay, home brewing and dance parties, this is the thing that everyone needs in their home, right? Absolutely everyone needs home brews and dance parties. And then, the 98% of regular people look at that and say, actually, no, I don't know that I need this kind of thing. And so there's a perception that home automation has a lot to do with toys. I want to dispel that myth that home automation is really all about toys. And in order to do that, I need to go to the source. This would be the person who invented the whole concept of home automation. As with many inventors, as with many innovators, he did not know that he was inventing home automation when he did his thing. But nevertheless, he is the first person to start us on this road of home automation. And of course, I'm sure all of you will recognize, oh, and by the way, the other part of home automation that I forgot to mention. This is an actual part of the HTTP spec, by the way. This is a real code that is required by HTTP implementations to implement if it's appropriate. So if you buy a internet-enabled teapot, it may very well do this for you. So thought I'd throw that in there. I'm sure not everybody knows. Anyway, that innovator, that person who invented the concept of home automation, Thomas Edison, back in the 1870s. So yes, this is a concept that has been around for a bit longer than the computer. And you may be sitting here kind of confused and thinking, okay, so Thomas Edison invented home automation. He didn't do it in Python, or at least not in any way that I would recognize. So what did he do exactly? And the answer, of course, is his most famous, perhaps the invention that he's the most celebrated for, which is the electric light. Now, if you look at an electric light and you compare it to the technologies of the day, you begin to realize that light bulbs aren't necessarily all that compelling of a technology when you compare it to the technologies of the day, and especially with the infrastructure of the day, right? So here's a light that you can't really use unless you have a special device that you attach it to. You have to in order for that device to work, it has to be wired, which means you have to either rip into the walls of your house, or you have to run these tubing all over the walls that's really kind of ugly. And then on top of that, those wires have to be connected to a service, and that service you have to pay for. You have to pay a new monthly bill. So, hey, we're signing up for a new monthly bill. We're ripping up our walls. We're buying a whole bunch of expensive equipment in order to get the capability that we've had for thousands of years, namely lighting up your house. So how is this a thing? How come electric lights or electricity took off from the 1870s, where everyone's like, electricity, yeah, that's just some toy, to the 1890s and 1900s, where people could not electrify fast enough? And the answer is that the real innovation with the electric light is not necessarily the light bulb, it's the light switch. If you think about how lights were done back, if you're in 1860 and it's dark and you want to see things, how do you do that? Well, it generally involves fire. So you either, light a fireplace, or you light a candle, or you have like a kerosene lamp or a lantern or something like that, and you have to go find matches. So if you're coming home to a dark house and you're like coming in the door, well, you're sitting here fumbling, okay, where is that? Oh God, what drawer did I put the matches in? Oh, I can't remember. And then you trip over something and fall on the floor, and it's not very pleasant. As opposed to the modern era. You just walk up and flick a switch, and light shows you everything in your house and shines the way. Today, we don't really take that as much of anything. It's not home automation. It's just life. It's just reality. It's like it's receded so far back into our consciousness that we don't even recognize it as a thing. But really, this is the first home automation when you compare this to how you did lighting for thousands of years, and compare that to lighting today. I think everyone would agree this is better. And whether you use like traditional incandescent Edison-style light bulbs like this, or whether you use something fancy like LEDs or whatever, the idea that you can walk up to a switch and flip it and light comes on is an amazing innovation in home automation. We'll talk about another one. This is also an Edison innovation, and it has to do with the idea that sometimes you're in your house and you're bored and you want to listen to music. Well, how did you do that in 1860? You sung, or you whistled, or you played an instrument. Everyone gathered around the piano and everyone sings, and of course your Aunt Marie can't carry a tune in a bucket, so you're sitting there going, oh, okay, I'm really enjoying this. Well, along comes Edison. And he says, here you go. All you have to do is put in this little cylinder and lower this thing down, and boom, beautiful music comes out of that strange-looking horn. It's not something, again, that you think of when you think of home automation, but when you consider the laborious process that was gone through in order to create music for most of human history compared to what we can do today, of course, we have much more advanced technology than this old thing, but the basic concept is the same. You get to control when you play music and what music you hear and who does the singing and all that good stuff. That's something that we didn't have for a long time. This is another example. I could go on. There's like a bunch more technologies. I'll point out just a few. The washing machine, and you'll excuse me for a minute. That is going to go off pretty much my whole talk if I don't tell it to stop. I apologize for the, yeah, I should do that, right? Let's do 120 minutes. There we go. So I'm going to be sleeping at night tonight sometime, and that thing's going to go off, and my wife's going to jump out of bed and kill me. So anyway, the washing machine. It seems like kind of an interesting, it's one of those labor-saving devices that came about in the early 20th century. As a home automation tool, if you think about how people used to wash clothes, the way you wash clothes, well, you got not up close and personal with a bucket full of water, and you sat there and you swirled your own clothes in that thing all day. Then all of a sudden along comes this thing, and instead of having to spend hours washing clothes, you take a few minutes, make sure you sort stuff, pick your Tide Pod, and don't eat it. Stick it all in this machine, press a button, and walk away. Half an hour or so later, you got a bunch of wet but clean clothes. Take them out of that, put it in the dryer. Again, an hour later, you've got clothes that are ready to wear. This is actually the kind of thing, there are some people who believe that a lot of the advancements that have come for women's rights have come about because of devices like this, because quote unquote in the past, a woman's place was in the home, and she had, of course she had a job. She had to do all the washing and all the cleaning and all of this and all of that. And it was devices like this that enabled people to say, okay, now that we don't have to do those things anymore, maybe it's possible for women to actually follow their dreams and other crazy ideas like that. So you can see the impact that this has had in our society, not just in the sense of making life easier, but in enabling life for whole groups of people. The final example, and this is the one that's probably the most like what you might consider traditional home automation. How many people have one of these in their house? How many people have seen it before? How many people grew up in a house with one of these? Yeah, the thermostat. Again, go back to 1860. What was it like to make your house warmer in the winter? If you didn't want to freeze to death, what was the process? Well, it usually involved more fire. You can imagine, there were a lot of fire deaths back before the 20th century, and you can kind of see why, because it seemed like anything worth doing involved fire in some way or another. So yeah, you had to go and, light up the Franklin stove or light up the fireplace or whatever, and the whole idea that you could pick your temperature, there were two temperatures, basically really cold and only sort of cold. And you got to choose one of those two, as opposed to this, where you could see there's numbers on that dial, 60, 70, 80. You could actually decide, I want it to be 72 degrees, not 73, not 71, but 72 degrees. And, you say that to someone, back, like, say, 1860. They'd be like, you're nuts. But with home automation, again, you just turn this dial and walk away, and most of the time you don't even know what's going on. You have no clue. You just know that the house is warm, and it's at exactly the temperature you want. This is what home automation is all about. And I bring up these old technologies because the ultimate goal has not changed. The idea behind home automation is not just to have dance parties and home brews. It's make your life easier. So there are a few principles I want to talk about really quick. What you might call principles of successful home automation. Some of these are new, but a lot of these also apply to some of those old technologies. You should not have to adapt to technology, right? It was a lot easier to flip on a light switch than it was to, find the matches and, stick it in the little hole on the lantern and all that stuff. The idea is that it should be easier. It should either be easier or it should be almost the same thing that you did before. Remembering that you're not the only person using your home automation. So folks who have the fancy app where you have to type in this special code and write a little bit of Python every time you want to turn on a light, not going to work. There are a lot of people in your house who are going to be like, could I go back to the old way of turning on lights? Limit the impact of false positives and negatives. Put it another way, the thing has to work. When you press a button, it has to do the thing. If it doesn't do the thing, somebody's going to be pissed, and they're going to be angry, and they're not going to be happy. The perfect app is no app. A lot of people get involved in the idea that, you have a phone or some kind of like touch screen or whatever, and you do the things in there. The perfect app is kind of like the thermostat, right? How many people would be really, really keen on every time they got cold, they had to pull their phone out and say, "I'm cold, turn on the heat." And then you'd hear the heat come on, and like half an hour later, you'd be warm again. How many people are up for that? Not a whole lot. I don't see any hands, which I can't see much anyway, but hey. That's the idea. If at all possible, if the thing just works in the background, that's kind of the automation part of home automation, making it just work. And then finally, this is of course not a problem Thomas Edison had to worry about, but your system should run at home, not in the cloud. You can kind of extrapolate that more generally into saying, you should have control over your app, whether you have internet access or not. You should have control over your data, whether your home provider, your service provider wants to give it to you or not. I have a thermostat at home. My smart thermostat at home is by a company that actually puts rate limits and makes it actually kind of difficult for their thing to use. I'm probably going to replace it, because if I can't go into my stuff, if I decide that I need to turn up the heat because I know that a cold front's coming through or something like that, and then my app, my home automation system can't talk to it because the cloud service is like not cooperating, what good is it? I'd be better off with that round thing on the wall. So all of these principles and all of this stuff boils down to a quote like this: "Good home automation never annoys, but is missed when it is not working." And here, I'll just point out the fact that everyone here, I'm sure, has been through a power outage. And how many people actually get out the candles when the power goes out? And how many people prefer the experience of getting out the candles to having light switches in their home? Anyone? Yeah. Some of us are weird. Everyone loves the home automation of the light switch. Everyone loves the thermostat. When it doesn't work, that generally causes huge consternation and but when it's working right, you almost don't notice it. It just fades into the background of your life and you just sort of live with it. Now, I've put this quote and also the 5 points below, and I've pointed out this guy, Paulus Schutzen, also known as Baloob, and I think I misspelled his handle. It's 2 L's, but Baloob on most social media networks. Paulus is the creator of Home Assistant. He was the creator of those 5 points on my previous slide, and he is the person who created that quote. A lot of the success of Home Assistant is due to the fact that Paulus is not just a techie guy. He's the type of person who thinks about the point of home automation. He thinks about why we're doing this. And that is one of the reasons why Home Assistant is not just the premier Python DIY system for doing home automation. It is the premier system for doing home automation in pretty much any language. So, and you can see down there, I got a link to the blog, which is where I got those points and where this quote comes from. His blog is very interesting. Most of it is like updates to Home Assistant. Hey, we support such and such device now. But a lot of it is little blurbs like what I've just told you, where he talks about what motivates him, why he does what he does. And it's very interesting to see. I think he has a very good perspective. So, Home Assistant as a technology has some strengths that other systems don't have. So you have a lot of momentum right now going behind Home Assistant. If you go into Reddit and you go into like the home automation subreddit, for example, half the time if you go in there and you ask people to recommend a system for you, they'll say Home Assistant. And this is like not just Home Assistant as compared to something some guy wrote in Perl or something like that. This is like Home Assistant as opposed to, say, SmartThings or HomeKit or Wink or some of these other big name technologies. And I think some of the strengths of that come from basically 3 sources. Number one, because Home Assistant is written in Python, he has a set of resources that most people don't have. Most other languages don't have. Python, as people may have known if you watch the tech news or what have you. There's a lot of stories going on about how Python is one of the fastest growing developer platforms out there. It's like growing like crazy, and some people are now saying it's going to be more popular than JavaScript, which might happen. I mean, we'll see. But certainly, Python it's a very popular language, which means that when he goes and he needs to interface with something or other or do some weird, obscure thing, chances are someone's already done the work for him. So he gets to leverage the strength of a lot of other people who are trying to get a lot of the same things done. Home Assistant is open source, very much so, very aggressively open source. He's made several promises that he's never taking this private, that he's limiting any kind of like money-making or commercial opportunities just to the parts that are necessary. And this allows, again, this idea that anyone can come in and make changes to the system. You don't have to sit there like with my thermostat that I mentioned before, where I have to sit here and go, please, please, Mr. Thermostat developer, please let me have my data. And they say, no, I'm not going to let you have your data. And you feel kind of like left out, like, wait a minute, it's my data, it's my, the thermostat is there, the heater is upstairs, but some guy in New York is telling me what I can and can't do? What's the problem with this? So having open source be the dominant paradigm for how things are set up means that if you don't like the way Home Assistant works, you can change it. And a lot of people do, and a lot of people have, which is one of the reasons why Home Assistant is so good. Finally, one of the really strong things about Home Assistant is that it is a REST-based, it buys into the whole idea of REST-based services, microservices, small things, doing one thing well, interacting with others using common and very well-defined interfaces. This makes it very easy to do some expansions on, Paulus doesn't have to think of everything. If other people want to do something, it doesn't even have to be a part of Home Assistant in order for us to take advantage of it. And I'll have some examples of that later. All right, so now that's my overview, my rant, my speech about home automation. This is the part that everyone can, if you fell asleep, I kind of forgive you. I've done it before. So here's the part where we get to nitty-gritty. As I mentioned, because this was kind of a rush, I don't have much in the way of demos. I will show some demos in just a few minutes, but generally speaking, like I can't do an install or show you how that works or whatever. But these are the basic ideas. Home Assistant has a number of ways to install. They create a little image that works on most of the little single board computer things like Raspberry Pis and so on. You can just download an image, slap it on there, and boom, you've got Home Assistant. They do a lot of very good work to make that as easy as possible. They have a plug-in system and an expansion system that allows you to pull stuff in. And that's a really nice system. If you're not the type of person who gets into your Python, then that might be a good way to go. If you're more techie, if you want to get into the nuts and bolts, Home Assistant is pip installable. It's generally recommended to do this in a virtual env of some kind, and you need Python 3.5 or better. Yes, that is correct. I said it. Home Assistant does not run at all on Python 2. Legacy Python, exactly. So, basically any modern Linux distribution will have the version of Python you need. If you want to play with Windows, I'm not sure how much of Home Assistant works on Windows because a lot of the driver code and stuff uses Linux-isms and things like that. And again, same with Mac OS. But generally speaking, you want to use a virtual env because Home Assistant has a very nice feature. In order to enable hardware drivers, if you will, Home Assistant, when it starts up, will actually install and update and upgrade modules for you in the background, sort of while you're not looking. So it does its best to make sure it's got the very best code and the very latest code, and like adding support for, you'll click in the UI and say, I want to add support for my Philips Hue. In the background, it'll go and pip install a bunch of stuff to make that possible. So you probably want to use a virtual env to make sure that that doesn't interfere with other things. Also, if you're the type of person who's into this whole container thing, you can run Home Assistant in a Docker container. There's the link to the Docker container in Docker Hub. There they have more information, and also you can find this stuff on the Home Assistant website. Basically, you can Docker run. You give it a special place to put your configuration files, and that pretty much does it. If you know Docker, then that should get you off to the races. All right, so now it's demo time. And this is where things get really interesting, because now I'm going to try to do something. Let's see. Exit. Okay, and that is humongous. I'm going to see if I can make this smaller. Whoa, that's like not helping. All right. Bear with me for a minute. I'm going to see. This thing doesn't like, I don't know if it's like the way that this projector works or whatever, but it likes to, it thinks that the projector is really huge. And I'm not sure why. No, it's set to the right place there. Okay, well, I will do a lot of scrolling if I can. Let me see. So anyway, we'll do the best that we can with the demo that we have. It's at the lowest it allows. Go bigger? Okay, let me try that. All right. Let's go to display 2. Let's go to that and apply. Cross our fingers. Hey, awesome. That's better. And we will keep changes. Do not change it back, please. All right, so this is what the main UI for Home Assistant looks like. This is actually a deprecated user interface. I haven't upgraded yet to the new one. The new one is super fancy and allows for graphs and charts and pictures and video and all kinds of crazy stuff. This is basically just, hey, you can do stuff. And this is, because again, this was kind of a last minute sort of preparation. This is my actual house. My wife is home. So, what shall we do? She's, I think generally, like, I'm going to get home and she's going to be like, you were playing with that thing again, weren't you? Fortunately, she doesn't know where it is. I've hidden it very well. Guess why? All right, so here you go. I've clicked on a particular light. This is a corner light in the living room, and you can see there's all kinds of information you can set. If your light supports brightness, here, let's do this, this light. And this one, no, let's not do that light. Let's go over here, and I'm going to do a different light. So if I do this light here, and this is the system one is one where I just stick a bunch of stuff. Generally speaking, this is a nice thing about Home Assistant. This is like the techie page. The other page is more for, these are the lights you actually care about. If you actually need to turn on or off a light or do something interesting, you can do it from there. So there's the color light. And okay, for some reason it is not happy. This light actually does colors. But it's not going to let me for some reason. So maybe I need to turn it on first. Let's turn it on. There we go. So now, if I want to, I can make the color, I can make this like, you know, that color, or I can make it that color, or, you know, whatever. Now, to be clear, just to make this clear, this is a Hue light bulb that I'm using Home Assistant's Hue integration. You can see it's basically just like using the Hue app. I have all the functionality I need, and it's not specific to the Hue. So if I go over, for example, if I get out of there, and I go back over here, and I go to this lamp here, this lamp has the same interface. It doesn't do color, so if I turn it on, it's not going to really do color. Let's see if I can do my mouse. See there, it'll turn on. There it goes. This is on an Insteon network. Now you can see the interface is just the same. It's like, I don't need to care if it's an Insteon bulb or a LiFX bulb or a Hue bulb or some weird Chinese bulb that Home Assistant supports. It's all the same thing. I have it integrated with my media center. So for example, my wife is not watching TV. But she could be. I have scenes set up, so this does stuff with the lights. So I can make the lights dim or I can make them bright. In another page I'll show you, I actually use those in automations. I can turn on and off the receiver and do some controls with my Roku, let's see, yeah, my Chromecast. And I also have a Google Home speaker, which I can do some interaction with as well. I have a climate tab, which gives me all kinds of information about the climate. This weather stuff is coming from Weather Underground, along with the weather forecast. This is a Z-Wave detector. It's a sensor that detects a bunch of things, like the upstairs temperature, humidity, and so on and so forth. And then I have my thermostat, which, as I mentioned before, this is the thermostat that the developers don't want to give me my data. So this doesn't always work really well, but if I, at least in theory, if I want to, I can click it and I can turn my temperature up, and you can see I get a nice graph. Let's go over here, and I can show you some more fun graphs. The history graph, which shows you all kinds of information about what's been going on with my house, like when did the speaker get turned on? When did the lights get, stuff done with the lights? See, like here, this tells me the sun was below the horizon last night, and then it rose. But wait. It set later that day. Yeah, I know, these are concepts that are just hard. Now, I joke, but I'm going to get back to that in a little while. I'm sorry? I believe it's a local. It actually calculates this. So, and then if you go down here, I have a precipitation graph, and here's some information about the temperature, both the temperature outside, the heat index, things like wind chill, except of course not today, the thermostat, what the thermostat has done, target temperatures, all that good stuff, nice little graphs, wind speed down below, if that were something interesting to me, which it's not, but hey, I got the graph. Humidity. And this actually tracks, this is useful because it tracks humidity outside and inside. And I actually have automations tagged off of humidity that will turn on the AC if it gets too humid. So try that with your typical, wall dial thermostat. And then, of course, things like upstairs brightness. When the sun is up, then it gets bright in that room, and so I can see that sort of thing. So, and then finally, there's all kinds of fun developer tools. So, for example, you can look at the raw states, and you can change the states of things. And this is the part which gets into the Python side of things. These are the hooks that you can use. You can Home Assistant exports a REST API, and you can use that with some of this stuff. The documentation's on the site, and you can write code that will tell Home Assistant to do things. And we're going to see some examples of that here in just a minute. In fact, I think I will go back and we will attempt to present once again. There it is. Except, of course, it's wrong because Linux. This is a Linux desktop. I am a proud user of the Linux desktop. And I think here, in order to make this work, I have to do this. There we go. All right. So we'll have to go through that exercise again later, just so you know. I'm sure you were all just thrilled to hear that. All right. Whoa, a little bit too fast. Let's go back. So far what we've talked about has not been very Python specific. And that is because the interfaces that were created by Paulus Schoenemann, by Balub, when he created Home Assistant were not specific to, like, he didn't write a specifically Python interface. Most of the way that you interact with it is via the REST API or via these YAML files that are basically like a scripting language. It's kind of terrible, it just is. But because of the fact that he made it open and he made it available, like made it easy for people to hook stuff in, someone came along and hooked something in called AppDaemon. AppDaemon is, in short, a little add-on, an extension that runs in a separate process and interacts with Home Assistant basically over these REST APIs. And what it allows you to do is write Python to control your home. This is kind of like the payoff. If you're a Python geek and you're like, I want to write Python code that makes my lights flash and do the dance parties, there it is. There you go. So, this is an example of some code that you might write, and this particular code watches a motion sensor and then turns lights on for 60 seconds, but only at night. So you can see that it actually checks on whether the sun is down or the sun is up. It turns the light on and then sets a timer, basically 60 seconds later, turn it back off. And the idea is that as long as the motion sensor is reporting in, it's going to say, hey, this person's here. So there you have an example of actually being able to write Python code in a rather standard API to control your house. This is really cool. Someone else has come along. I actually think the AppDaemon guy did this. He added on an entirely separate UI layer that's completely different from the one that Home Assistant itself has. And it works perfectly well. And again, the whole idea is this is embraced by the upstream developers. This kind of thing is like totally cool. Another example of this, which I'm going to show you, and we'll actually do a demo of this, is something called Node-RED. Node-RED is actually older than Home Assistant. It's an experiment that IBM did, of all people. And the idea was they wanted to create a generic user interface for doing what they call flow-based programming. You can see how you have all these flows and you have all these connections and stuff like that. It's not written specifically for home automation, but it turns out to be really awesome for home automation. And it's actually written in JavaScript, Node.js. It's not written in Python. But because it does this REST API, it's open source, it's all cooperative, it integrates into Home Assistant like it was made for it. And you can extend it, and of course there are a lot of extensions. One of them hooks Node-RED into Home Assistant. There are extensions that hook it directly into a lot of hardware platforms, into things like MQTT, a lot of other things. And here, we are going to go through that wonderful process of changing the resolution again so that I can do another demo. Let's do that, and apply. And it's not going to be happy. Keep the changes, yes. Oh, there, it actually liked that. I'm not sure why. Let's do that. All right. This is, again, Node-RED as running on my system at home. And here you have essentially a set of flows that, again, do pretty much the thing that, you'd kind of expect. So here I have a trigger that is set to a particular sensor that detects whether I'm home or not, because when I get home or when my wife gets home, our phone connects to our router. And the router tells Home Assistant that these phones have connected to the router. And based on that, I can write a rule that says, when I get home, do these things. And what it then does is it does a bunch of things that have to do with flow-based programming, like change the message to set the payload, split it, do some other crazy things. And what this does is it turns on a couple of lights in the house. So the moment I arrive home, if my wife and I are out and it's after dark, remember that sun thing? You know how it remembered that the sun had risen and then that it had set? Well, here you go. With this, if we're out and we come home to a dark house, when we pull up in the driveway, the lights come on. And then about 10 minutes later, the system assumes, and you can see right here, there's a delay for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, it assumes that we figured out what we want to do with the lights, so it turns those lights back off so that they're not on all the time. Let's see if I can find some other examples of some things. Yeah, so this is my office light. It basically says, when I turn on the switch, which is a smart switch, when I turn on the switch to turn on the lights in my office, also turn on this other light over here. And when I turn that switch off, turn that other light off too. I have a special routine just for my wife when she gets home. I don't remember what that does, and I'm suspecting that I don't want to remember at the moment, so we'll just skip that. One cool thing that I have an infrared sensor that reads a remote. That, like I have a remote that's just programmed to some, I think it's programmed to pretend it's a TiVo. And then I have an infrared sensor that hooks into this home automation system. And the way it works, it kind of works like a poor man's Logitech Harmony, only it's better, because when I can switch inputs, like, you know how when you switch inputs with most of those universal remotes, if the remote you're not on the right device, then you're like hitting buttons and it's changing the channel, but you're not watching channels, you're watching Netflix or something like that. With this system, it actually figures out what the proper input is and always sends the right response. So no matter how you switch, so if you switch to the TiVo and then you're running Netflix, or if you switch over to this other thing, or if you're watching regular TV, whatever it is, when you hit buttons on the remote, the right thing happens every time. So, for what it's worth. I have behaviors for things like double tapping certain smart switches, make bunches of lights come on. I have scenes doing some of that stuff. Lights for dusk and dawn. So at dusk, I have a couple of lights come on very dim so that they're like night lights. And then in the morning, they shut off. So, you don't have to worry about turning on lights in the evening if you don't want to. So weather alerts, I have a little dongle that lights up and flashes when the weather changes, like if a weather alert comes in. So, and as I mentioned, all of these you just program, you can write a new program basically by taking and dragging and dropping. That injects a timestamp, and then you can go down here and you can say, I want to make it, I want to delay it by a little bit of time. So when I click the button, I want it to come in like 5 seconds later. And then you drag and drop drag and drop. Come on, mouse. There we go. No, that's not it. Okay, we'll get it. There we go. Drag and drop like this. And now we have a flow. When I click this button, this thing waits 5 seconds and then does absolutely nothing. But I could keep going if I wanted to. All right. So, and again, the whole idea behind this is that down here at the bottom, where is it? Yeah, down here. See all these nodes labeled Home Assistant? Those are nodes that basically know how to talk to Home Assistant via this REST API. And everything you can do in something like AppDaemon or with the special scripts, you can do in Node-RED, which means if this way of programming your home automation system works for you, this is a really good alternative to doing some of those other things. So you see how giving you the choice and having these standards kind of helps you out. So, all right. We will go back here, and rather than go through the thing with the resolution, I will just say thank you very much, and I will take questions.